Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, Cadence Independent Media Production. Today, we are kicking off a mini-series about sounds from the past divided by decade. Today, the Roaring 20s. First things first, this isn't going to be a style-specific episode in terms of how you may think you should play a set like this. This has to do with what these sounds are and both why they were there then and what we can do with them now in a more modern context. The 20s are a pretty early era in jazz. There was a lot of different styles going on at the time, and a lot of new things were starting to get integrated into the drum set, which at that point they called a trap set, short for contraption, because it was just a bunch of stuff that made sounds that were fun and musical and inspired the musicians and the dancers. And we are using sort of I would say kind of like standard representation of that era, things we've seen online. We did some research, and I want to go over everything that's on the kit before we get too deep into this. The first thing you'll probably notice, other than that there's no hi-hat, is that these are not old drums. These are drums that we use here all the time, a particularly special snare drum that was featured in a spotlight a while back, and I'll talk about that. As we kind of realized here, you don't have to go and buy specific instruments to make these sorts of sounds. There's a lot you can do with tuning, head choice, and basically all modern things and get into the realm of these ideas without having to make a huge investment. Thanks so much to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. Skillshare is an online learning community comprised of thousands of classes spanning so many subjects. There's something for everybody on there. It's a wonderful opportunity and experience online to learn something new. You can find videos tailored to graphic design, interior design, self-care. There's something for everybody on there. I'm particularly super excited about the Ultimate Self-Care Playbook with Jonathan Van Ness, both because I was already a fan and because it's always fun to see people that you admire talk about things that really matter to them. I've been a fan of Jonathan since the first season of Queer Eye, and I've really been impressed with the arc that his life has taken and all of the ways that he's found opportunities to improve himself and take care of the people around him, and anything like that that can inspire me on a daily basis is definitely worth spending my time on. Through the end of September 2021, the first 1,000 subscribers that click through will get a month free to explore everything that it has to offer with no restrictions and find the things that get them the most excited about learning. This 1 month free of the Skillshare Premium membership gives you access to everything on there. If you want to try to watch every single video on there in that month, you're welcome to try. It's probably impossible. Just click the link in the description below to find your path over there, and thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring us today. Now, to be totally upfront, there is nothing on this kit that is old or vintage or from the 20s. This is all modern stuff. It's all modern heads. There's no calf heads on here or anything like that. And it's important to know that you can get vintage drums. You can get modern drums that emulate vintage drums. There's a lot of opportunities to spend a lot of money going after sounds where, on the other hand, you can look at what you have and you can get into making adjustments and checking out the possibilities of what you already have, because at the end of the day, unless we need it to look a certain way or something like that for a show or photos or something like that, you really can get a lot out of modern instruments with just a little bit of detective work, a little bit of adjustment, and keeping track of where you were. And it's another opportunity to get to know the instruments you already have a little bit better and maybe decide that you like your splash cymbal again. In getting into the gear that we are using today, we're going to start with the snare drum, which is from Third and Fourth Drum Company. We featured it in a video a while back. It's got a couple of sort of old-timey features. It's a pretty thin shell. It has single flange hoops with claws to hold them on, give it kind of a vintage vibe, but not a super expensive drum, not from the 20s or anything like that. We have modern wires on there, regular old 3mm snare side, and a calf tone batter on here to kind of darken it up a little bit and bring us into Dixieland territory. But again, nothing particularly crazy, a couple of head choices, couple tuning choices, and it's doing the thing that we need it to do. Next up, we're going to talk about the rack tom. It's our normal 10-inch rack tom, but we were talking about how the integration of toms into the kit came from Chinese tom-toms that were literally, strapped or bolted or something onto a marching bass drum much larger than this one. Those drums had tacked on heads that were not tunable, and they were made of animal hide, so the weather would affect them. If they broke, it was a whole thing to replace it. Obviously, we don't have to worry about that anymore, but those drums also had a very short sound because of how much contact the wood and the head had with each other because of the mounting, and also because the shells, generally speaking, were pretty thick, almost like a taiko drum or something like that. So short sound, punchy, thuddy, not a lot of tone, not a lot of sustain, just going for something that felt era specific. Now, if you think this drum sounds weird, that's because it does. We're going for a really specific sound that is not modern and that is not a traditional tom in terms of a modern drum set. On this drum right now, we are using a calf tone batter with an E-ring to further kind of like take away any modern overtones we might run into. And we have a coated G12 on the bottom, which is a little bit thicker than what we would normally use for a reso, but helps to, again, just kind of squash everything down. It's also worth noting that I have the batter tuned much higher than the reso and the reso tuned much lower than I normally would. This is to, again, get immediate attack on this pretty muffled batter and then almost no sustain, but just a little bit of tone so that it sounds like a tom and not a cardboard box. It's also worth noting that if you go back and listen to recordings from this era, the way that they were produced makes it extremely difficult to hear exactly what's going on, and the drums are very quiet in the mix because of the way that they laid out the musicians when they recorded it. So go back and listen, but understand that there are some recordings where you may only know there's drums in them because of the cymbal chokes, because they're so bright and loud, and the rest of this is going to be far, far under the rest of it. Now to the bass drum, our normal Pearl 22-inch bass drum that we use all the time. We have retrofitted it a little bit with a calf tone EQ4 on the front, no port, and we have a coated G1 on this side, which I have affixed a drum G and a little kind of bandana to emulate the mounted mufflers that they used to use back then to just sort of focus the sound. They didn't put things in the drums, generally speaking, but there were a lot of sort of external muffling systems that would clip to the edge and then press onto the head and things like that to dial it in, using our sort of own interpretation of that, but again, getting us closer to an era-specific sound. Additionally, we're using a fluffy sort of bomber beater on the bass drum to bring us even further into only generating bass with this drum. Not a lot of attack, not a lot of punch or anything, more of just a warm, low sound underneath, which is particularly functional because a lot of this music utilized tuba for the bass instrument, which is very punchy, very short, very bright, so there's a lot of room to fill out the low, low end underneath. Moving to the cymbals, we have an 8-inch Avidus Zildjian Splash, which is probably what was actually there in the 20s, and we have a 14-inch K Mini China, which is along the lines of the Chinese cymbals they would have used then, only theirs would have been from China and the more sort of like heavily hammered with more of like a handle-shaped bell on them. We hung it like this inverted because that was the style back then. They didn't have cymbal stands the way that we have cymbal stands now, and they would use kind of whatever they had to just to get all of their instruments close enough to where they could hit them. Finally, to our percussion setup, cowbell, woodblock. Pretty common. You hear them in this music. You hear it in modern Dixieland jazz bands and ragtime situations and stuff. Fun, kind of kitschy, makes me smile every time I hit them. I mean, you can't go wrong. In a very recent episode, we talked about all of the ways to use a towel to sort of help you along on your journey with your drum set in different ways that you wouldn't think of. We are using one today in one of the methods in that video, which is on top of a music stand to both create traction and isolation for the percussion instruments, and also to make sure that when I pick up brushes and sticks, it doesn't make any noise. A couple other things to note about the setup is that I canted the snare drum super steep because in this case, like the sounds, it inspires me to play in a certain way, and this is what you would probably see if you watch videos about this kind of music or if you study photos, things like that. Additionally, we brought the cymbals in really low like this. They're in positions that are not rideable because we're not going to be riding on them because ride cymbals weren't a thing back then. These were accent cymbals. They were sort of like pitted against each other of sort of like a common sound and an exotic sound. And they sort of are the part of the set that's bright and everything else is basically pretty dark. Now on to the other side of this. You can play era-specific music on an era-specific setup. If you want to, there's nothing wrong with that, and there's lots of opportunities where that's the exact right thing to do. I'm thinking particularly about bands that specialize in this sort of thing, or maybe events where they're looking for that. But on the flip side, I think it's super fun to get into an experience where you're taking these sounds and injecting them into a totally different scenario. I've heard sounds like this in pop music. I've heard sounds like this in rock music. There's sounds like this in some hip hop now, and especially pitted with drum machines as well. You can really get a sort of confluence of old-timey and new-timey stuff that ends up making something new. Now, not everything that you saw me play today is 20s specific or even would have necessarily been the popular thing in that era. I'm not a specialist in 20s music, and that's okay. I love these sounds, however, and as we go through these decades, you're going to see a really cool evolution of these sounds that results in the sounds that we're used to now, with little things coming and going and choices being made that respect the music, dancers, the media, what was popular at the time, the culture in general, that takes us from something like this all the way to where we are now. Another place that I think is interesting to check out things like this is people like Stanton Moore and some other people where they kind of integrate parts of this sound into their kit, but maybe not as the primary instrument, such as an auxiliary bass drum that sounds like this, or maybe an auxiliary snare drum that sounds like this, or possibly this is your main snare drum and something more modern is off to the left, so that you can almost kind of switch eras and decades in the moment and sort of paint with these sounds over the course of a single tune without committing to it as a complete sound for the show. All right, that about wraps it up. Thanks for joining us on this first sort of foray into this journey. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you hear about all of our new videos. Lots of exciting things coming out, particularly over on the Patreon. Please check out everything over there. Follow the link below. The Cymbal series lives there. All of our extra footage and anecdotes and everything else, keeping us going here. We appreciate it so much. Thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this episode. Do get down there, click that link, follow it through, get your 1 month of the premium membership, and find something that gets you excited. And finally, if you are a person who utilizes era-specific drumming either in a band that is about that era, or if you integrate it into other things, I mean, I'm going to ask this over and over again, but we would really like to know how you came to it and also what you do with them, because there's a lot of inspiration there in all these times, and not everybody gets an opportunity to check it out.